accounts of developmental disorders typically draw a very clear distinction between specific developmental disorders on the one hand and autism as a pervasive developmental disorder on the other. The main distinction is in terms of how widespread the child's difficulties are. Specific language impairment is seen typically as a rather isolated difficulty in language for a child who's otherwise developing fairly typically. Autism, on the other hand, is part of a constellation of problems, what's often referred to as a triad of abnormalities, affecting communication, social interaction, and a restricted repertoire of behaviour or restricted and repetitive interests. There are also rather more qualitative differences between a language impairment in specific language impairment and the types of communication problems you see in autism. For a child with specific language impairment, the language is often rather like that of a younger, typically developing child. Children with autism may have similar kinds of problems to those with SLI, but in addition they are likely to have communication problems that are not typical for a child of any age. So they may show repetitive use of language and over-literal interpretation of what other people have said. A child with autism may in fact have good vocabulary and produce long and complicated sentences, but what's unusual about them is how they use their language. Now, it's easy enough to distinguish between obvious textbook cases of autism and specific language impairment. But in actuality, we see many children who don't fit very neatly into either description, but seem rather to be somewhere between the two. For example, we may see children who have communication and social problems, very like those described as typical for autism, but they don't have the repetitive behaviours and restricted interests that form the third part of the autism triad. We can also see children who initially look as if they've got a receptive language disorder, but then as they grow older, they develop more repetitive behaviours and unusual interests. A lot of discussion has recently taken place among the people who are trying to update the diagnostic manual for identifying children's characteristics of children with particular different disorders. And they're really exercised as to what we should do about children who don't neatly fit into one category or another. One solution would be to broaden our category of autism to encompass these children, or we could put them in a separate category of their own if they don't fit neatly into the existing system. My own view is that rather than agonising too much about diagnostic labels, the key thing is to bear in mind that it's important to ensure that all children do get access to appropriate intervention. I think the most important thing is to have a thorough evaluation of language, communication and other strengths and difficulties so that the child gets the most appropriate placement where they'll get help, either from speech and language therapists or from people who have expertise in behaviour or both. If you'd like to know more about research on this topic, we've prepared a slide presentation that accompanies this video and gives you additional information.